Some may consider the position of this film a little extreme. They may think that the idea of personal self-defense against a killer government is an extreme idea. But in fact, if you look at the history of the world, and certainly the history of the 20th century, you look at the nations where the people had power, they weren't persecuted by their own government. If you look at the nations where the people didn't have power, they were subject to persecution. And in genocide after genocide in this film, we show exactly how that took place. This film does have a message. It has a moral of the story, as it were. It's a connection of three ideas: betrayal of trust, vicious cowardice, and powerlessness of victims. Any individual who acts in some way to try to stop people from protecting themselves, any individual who would work to disarm people, and oftentimes that's known as gun control, the idea that a person should not have the tools to defend themselves. Anyone who is willing to be part of the process of rendering the citizens defenseless is to blame. The Founding Fathers fully expected that Americans would be prepared at all times to fight a government. When the government becomes the enemy of the people, the Founding Fathers fully expected that the people would rise up against that government. It's right there in the literature. Alexander Hamilton wrote about it in Federalist Paper number 29. James Madison, considered the father of our Constitution, wrote about it in Federalist Paper number 46. They expressly expected that people would take to arms and stop a government that went too far. So they built into the Constitution, the Second Amendment, to be sure that Americans would never become the disarmed subjects of this government, to make sure this government never became a killer government, and to make sure that the scenes we saw in this film never could take place in America. Every American, maybe everyone in the world, but every American who has any interest at all in the future of a free nation, of a safe nation, of a prosperous nation, should also be a person who is interested in how to preserve that kind of nation. And the way to preserve that is to never give anybody more power than the people have. The warning sign on the horizon now is this drift in America and in Western civilization to downplaying the importance of self-defense, the downplaying that key value. And that's what this film is trying to get across, is that self-defense is the job of the individual. It's not the job of the authorities all the time. The individual ultimately has the duty and the right. And as we see Western civilization moving away from that, trying to centralize the defense of the society and take away the power from the people to do that, this movie shows the history of what happens to people who've been rendered powerless. There are about three things that we can't really do with this documentary. One of them is to communicate the impact of actually being there. We show still photographs and footage, but it doesn't really get across what it's like to be in the presence of brutal murder, what it's like to see the dead eyes of the killers in the killing squads, what it's like to see the panic and feel the fear in a persecution and an extermination. We can't give you that right there up close and personal. Another thing that we can't really get across is the sense of time. Again, we have short photos and video that people can see, but we can't give you the sense of what it's like to live day after day in dread and fear in a persecution, the endlessness of living in a prison camp, or the lifetime of scars, nightmares, and phobias that survivors live through. That sense of time, we just can't get it across as well as we'd like. Another thing is the pain of mind, the thoughts in the minds of a survivor, for example, who would replay over and over in his head, I wish I'd seen the warning signs. I wish I could have done something about this. I wish I'd had a weapon. I wish I could have fought back. I wish I could have protected my family members who were killed or persecuted. That pain of mind never goes away.
As a kid growing up in Tucson, Arizona, I was raised by my grandmother. most of her friends were Holocaust survivors. And I learned at an early age that there was always something very wrong with the picture, if I can put it that way. You always saw stacks of bodies at the death camps, but none of those bodies were holding a gun. But next to the bodies, you might see a Nazi soldier holding a gun. So it became pretty obvious to me, and perhaps in my Arizona environment, that a lack of being able to defend one's life had an awful lot to do with making it possible for governments to kill you. I thought this was a story that had to be told. It's a story that most people do not understand. It's a history lesson that most people are not getting in school. And the best way to tell people in America is to make a visual presentation instead of expecting them to read a book. So we set out on telling people information that lots of folks would rather they not know. And among them are folks who are supporting gun control schemes. And we wanted people to understand the downside of gun control, the side of gun control you never hear about on the 6